The meeting of the Planning Commission and Airport Zoning Commission for October the 16th, 2019 are called to order concurrently at 6:05 p.m. I'm going to, would you lead the Pledge of Allegiance for us tonight,
Okay.
please?
Please stand. Right hand over your heart. Please begin.
Pledge allegiance
to the flag
of the United States of
America, to the republic,
for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Madam Secretary, could we have the roll call, please?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioner Richard is absent at this point. Commissioner Caraveo,
Present.
Commissioner Ortiz,
Present.
Vice Chairperson Al-Shablabe,
Present.
and Chairperson Smith.
Present.
Thank you.
Oral communications. Please note the rules for meeting decorum on the screen. In the interest of time, these will not be read, but be advised that the Planning Commission will adhere to these standards. This is the time for the public to address the Planning Commission and the Airport Zoning Commission for items not on the agenda. Please note that if an item is scheduled as a public hearing, you will have an additional opportunity to speak when the public hearing is opened or continued. Comments made now regarding items scheduled for a public hearing will not be included in the official record of public testimony for that item. If anyone would like to address the Commission on items that are not on the agenda, please come up to the podium. Please address your comments to the Commission as a body and not to individual commissioners directly. Only very brief responses may be given to questions asked on topics not on the agenda. Please keep your remarks to 3 minutes. Would anybody like to come up and talk on anything that's not on the agenda?
Name's Gordon Michael Migo, native and resident of Hawthorne since October the 8th, 1952. It's in regards to what nominally is called granny flats or, tiny homes. There is so much talk about, we have like in Los Angeles about 66,000, homeless individuals out there at any given, time, recent count. And then there was also a study done that they found that there was about 100,000 units, whether they're houses or apartment units or otherwise that are unoccupied, and so there's something that they're trying to match up, homeless people to that, but that all depends on the owners of the properties and so forth, and whether private or government or something like that. But it seems to me that when they're like the city of Los Angeles recently was taken to task by a number of individuals that were pushing for the various parcel taxes, sales taxes, to generate revenue for the homeless housing and all that. And they says recently they discovered that building one unit for a homeless individual cost them $400,000, and they says, well, that's almost getting up there, like building a regular housing structure. And he says, you got to look at trying to build as many units for a much lesser cost so that you can house a whole lot of people. And I totally agree with that, and with that assessment. And there's whether it's government property or private property, the people want to participate in such in order to build these granny flats, which generally are from about 400, 500 square feet up to 900 to 1,000 square feet. And it would make a lot more sense because really a lot of homeless people, they want a nice place to live, but they don't need a huge place. They want a roof over their head, stay out of the weather, but it's nice. It's sort of like a bachelor's kind of quarters or something like that. You have like a little living area that can sub for sleeping quarters. And you have like a little kitchenette, bathroom, and places store things, little closet areas. And I think if we look to trying to build something along that way there, I think we can build a whole lot of units and house a lot of homeless people out there and provide, in addition to that, the necessary services for a variety of needs that they have, health, physical or mental, or they have food situations, health, job, kind of location services, different things like that. So we have to be very wise in the way we spend our money, and also trying to get the most, for the buck, so to speak. And so I'm just kind of putting it out there, and hopefully that as, and various cities up and down California are, and in other states too, but especially here in California, are considering, the different aspects of, solving the, homeless, situation. That we really have a very much of a health and safety issue. And when you see, like in various parts of Los Angeles, out in the streets, in the parks, vacant lots, whatever, and there's all that, discarded items and so forth. So there needs to be a kind of a concerted effort that, we could have, of course, with public consideration as to, what's available, what's appropriate, locations, and so on and so forth. And when they talk about all this piles of trash and so forth, food and other items, they should have, like, small, like apartment-sized, little, those blue dumpsters, places for them to toss the stuff instead of just piling it up out in the streets, on the sidewalks, in vacant lots, and then also, restroom facilities, so that they don't do their thing in people's yards, in the alleys, or whatever. So I think we can do, not only, the cities, South Bay, Los Angeles, and various areas, in the state, that I think if we look at trying not to make it like a gold-plated, kind of a affair, we can get a lot done and get a lot of people off the streets and provide them the services that we need to get them back on their feet, because,
Okay.
yeah.
Thank you then.
Okay.
You've gone over your time. Thank you. Is there anyone else?
Good evening. Ruben Sanchez, president of the North Hawthorne Community Association. I'm here to talk about, that's something that's not on the agenda, but it's in everybody's mind in regards of the Hawthorne Mall and the RFK building. I see a new face, and maybe I just wanted to kind of talk to her as well. These two locations, as you know, has been an eyesore for many years, and they're filming all the time in the Hawthorne Mall. They're making hundreds and thousands of dollars. And that's verifiable. You can check for studio rentals and so on. And so is the RFK building. Yet, maybe the city gets a couple of hundred here and there, but overall, they're making money. So the residents in North Hawthorne, every time when we see filming at these locations, it's like a big middle finger to our faces. Yet today we're here for a workshop on something that's so minute, that's punishing homeowners. But we have never seen a workshop placed for a Hawthorne Mall or the RFK building that is destroying our city, been destroying our city for multiple years. In fact, we were here not that long ago, and some of you agreed on voting in more high-density homes on the Crenshaw projects. These developers, that's all they want, high density. They can create and say, veteran or homeless or whatever they want to call it, whatever it is, it's high density. I'm just here letting you know that this is a fight that we've been doing for a long time, and I hope as we have a workshop today here for this, what we're here for the Airbnb and so on, we can have a big workshop with the whole community when it comes to these two locations. As I said, by them conducting business at these so-called vacant lots and still making hundreds and thousands of dollars, it's a big slap to the face, not only to North Hawthorne neighbors, but to the whole community. And it's all up to you to work on something. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Is there anyone else? Okay, seeing no one, I will close oral communications. We'll move to the Planning Commission and Airport Zoning Commission consent calendar. Are there any items?
No items.
So we'll recess the Airport Zoning Commission, and we'll do the Planning Commission consent calendar. Are there any items?
No items.
No items. Continued public hearings.
Again, no items.
Okay. New public hearings.
Same as above, no items.
Okay. So we'll recess the Planning Commission, call back to order the Airport Zoning Commission. Airport Zoning Commission consent calendar.
No items.
No items. Airport Zoning Commission new continued public hearings.
No items.
Okay. We'll call back to order the Planning Commission concurrently with the Airport Zoning Commission. Administrative items. We'll now have the workshop on short-term rental regulations and options.
Thank you, Chairperson. So we have our Associate Planner, Maria, who's going to make the presentation, but I just wanted to note that we have a few guests with us tonight. So we have Frank Feng, who's our Director of Business License and Finance, and then Oscar Lugo, who's one of our Code Enforcement Officers. So in preparation for this workshop, we recognize that there's a lot of different questions that get raised, and we thought that the public as well as the commission would benefit by having more voices at the table. So we have more people here who can answer questions about current city practices as well as observations on short-term rentals. And with that, I will hand it back to Maria.
Good evening, Commissioners. Thank you, everyone, for being here as well for this workshop. And we will be introducing a few items. And the purpose of the workshop is for the Planning Commission to explore if the city wants to permit the use and in what form. The demand for short-term rentals, as we call them STRs, to shorten the term, exists currently in the city, and staff has recognized that the use is occurring. I would like to introduce Oscar Lugo, to a Code Enforcement Officer, who will speak about the current conditions in the city and as it relates to STRs.
Good evening. In regards to short-term rentals, I currently actually am dealing with two properties. One is an apartment complex. It's in the residential area and each unit's being used as a short-term rental, so it's almost as if it's being used as an apartment complex in a residential area. Just a little while ago, I went onto a website called HomeAway, which is a short-term rental website, and they have currently 5 listings for this weekend in the Hawthorne area and 14 listed for the week before Thanksgiving. So either we allow them or we don't, they're still gonna operate. Also, Airbnb as well has 8 listings for this weekend and 8 before the weekend before Thanksgiving. So they're happening. They're here in Hawthorne. Like I said, there's 2 that I am aware of, and unfortunately on the websites they don't give you an address. They should just show you kind of the pictures of the interior and maybe the backyard, but not of the front yard. So, we try to do whatever we can in kind of recognizing the properties and try to find pictures that can give us kind of an identity of how the exterior of the front house or what street they might be in to try to address these issues. But these are short-term rentals that are going to keep occurring. They're going to operate either if we allow them or we don't. They're obviously operating now.
Thank you, Oscar, very much. So as you can see, why now? It is a timely subject. Some dwellings, the city inadvertently did provide a business license to, even though the use is not permitted in the city. And letters were mailed notifying those with the business license that it would not be renewed. They did reach out and they asked if the city would reconsider and explore the subject. And hence why we are having the workshop now. As I mentioned, the Hawthorne Municipal Code does not permit rentals currently as short-term rentals. They are not permitted based on the definition of a dwelling unit. So the definition, just so I can paraphrase it is a building or a portion designed or used primarily as a living quarters for one or more families, but it does not include hotels, motels, units having no kitchens, or other accommodations for the transient public. With that definition, we have prohibited short-term rentals. We don't state the word, but the definition definitely prohibits it. So what is a short-term rental? A short-term rental is a dwelling unit that is shared. It could be hosted or unhosted. The hosted STRs, as you can see from my slide, is where the host remains on site throughout the visitor's stay, except during the day, obviously, if they're working or they're out for some reason. But they are sharing the site or the building while the host is there. The other type is an unhosted. And the unhosted is a dwelling unit that is the primary dwelling for the tenants, but they do rent it out while the host is away. So for instance, if you're going to be out for a week, so you rent it as a short-term rental for somebody to be there while you're away. And that would be considered an unhosted. Usually these rentals are for periods up to 30 days, below that typically. And they do generate income for the property owner or the tenant if they're permitted to do so. There is one more type, which is a vacation rental. These are typically second units, homes, I should say. The property owner may own numerous homes and they just rent them for short-term rentals throughout the community, throughout many cities. So they're not their primary residence. So that's how ordinances typically distinguish the home sharing and the vacation rentals. What cities have required in terms of residency, because there is an issue, right? If we were to allow hosted or unhosted, we need to know proof of residency. And there's many avenues in which we can go through that. We can request income tax statements, driver's license, the assessment rolls, a homestead exemption, which many of you who own homes would probably have if that is your primary residence. A certification under penalty of perjury that you are the owner and live on the property. And also verification through inspections. And with this, I will introduce Melissa, who is our Assistant City Attorney.
They know who I am. Commission, thank you so much. Thanks, Maria. We did take a quick survey of what's happening around the South Bay so that we have an idea of what other cities are doing. As you can see on the slide, for the most part, this is a prohibited use, right? And much the same way, either it's prohibited because the definition excludes it or because it's specifically explicitly prohibited by the city. But there were a number of cities that are actually in the process of regulating them. You have Torrance, El Segundo. There's a pilot program in Hermosa Beach. So our takeaway from this was that also there's a recognition that even in the cities where the use is prohibited, if you take a look on Airbnb or HomeAway or some other platform, you'll see that there are still units that are being rented out as short-term rentals. So their challenge is enforcement, which can be very difficult. I think there's a recognition that this is something that's happening, and the other means by which a city can control this is through regulation. So they're exploring that. There are a number of cities that are exploring that, and we looked at those ordinances. We also took a look at many other cities, especially the larger cities. We looked at ordinances from Pasadena and Santa Monica, who have been very detailed in their regulations, especially Santa Monica. Santa Monica was actually sued, and they were successful. What they had done, among other things, is they have required the hosting platforms themselves to collect and remit what's called transient occupancy tax, TOT. And they were challenged by the hosting platforms, but they were successful. So they're a good example of being a little bit more aggressive about how they were doing things. We also looked at cities in Orange County and throughout the state. So we did take a survey of kind of what types of regulations are out there. So why would you regulate, right? I kind of alluded to that. That's one way by which you can control what you know is already taking place in your city. And a lot of times, obviously this is through our police powers. We're capable of regulating through our police powers. we want to take a look at what our policy is. And this is really from a lot of different cities. They wanted to make sure that the residential character of a neighborhood is not changed, right? When you have more people coming in and they're coming in with that turnaround, you have a possibility of increased traffic, increased noise, trash. So ensuring that that there are standards that ensure that the neighborhood doesn't change, that there are not these impacts that change the character of the community. That's what a policy, that's what a regulation can do. You can have standards, you can have performance standards. So some cities have looked at that. We want to preserve the character of our neighborhood. They also want to be able to track them. There's a lot of, as Oscar mentioned, there are no addresses on HomeAway or Airbnb, so you really don't know where they are. You have to kind of try to guess. Well, if you had a means of, if you were regulating and you were registering these properties and you have a way of tracking them, you want to make sure you get your TOT. That's another reason why you would want to regulate. You also want to recognize that, again, they do exist, and people are using them as a means of getting some additional income. And there are a lot of people in the community that do need that second income. It also creates an alternative short-term lodging option. There are obviously lots of hotels, but people want to have different options. So this would be something that you would be, by regulating, you would be allowing, just with the controls that you could put in. And you're also ensuring that when you do allow, if you do allow, you're not allowing to the extent that you are creating a loss of affordable housing options, because these properties, if they're being utilized in this way, they may not be utilized as an affordable housing option for a family, for example. So these are some of the policy reasons that you may think about as why you would want to regulate short-term rentals.
Thank you, Melissa. So there are several different types of hosting platforms. These are the most popular that I know many of you have seen or even utilized: Booking.com, Airbnbs, HomeAway, or VRBOs. And as I mentioned earlier, there are listings in Hawthorne, and our code enforcement officer has verified that there are. They are being utilized. Staff did find a few examples which we have provided to you and the public. So you can see that they are occurring. So where is an STR permitted? As I mentioned, STRs are not permitted in the city of Hawthorne currently. Should we permit them, and in what zones? And that's some of the questions that we are proposing to you. Should we only permit them in residential, commercial, or industrial zones? There are residential uses within some of our commercial and industrial zones currently. So there's different types of units that you may consider allowing for future STRs. Single-family dwellings, and that's anywhere from 1 to 4 units. So if there are more than one unit on a property, if there is more than one unit on a property, how many of these units can be utilized as rentals? Based on the commission's choice, do you want hosted, unhosted, or vacation rentals? That is something that we would want to explore. Apartments. How many apartments within a parcel? You can have apartments that have 30 units. Do we even want to go that route and allow apartments? That may be problematic. Condominiums. For example, the 360 development, their HOA does not permit STRs within that development. So there are certain developments that are currently already being controlled. For non-conforming structures, and these would be structures that are located within commercial and industrial zones that are utilized as residential, would we allow them to be STRs since they are in those zones already? So if we do allow them, so in which form are we going to allow them? Or are we just going to prohibit them completely? And as we have mentioned, they exist. So if they exist, do we want them just hosted, unhosted, vacation? One of the other questions that we have is who is allowed to establish an STR? Only the property owner? What about the leaseholder? Can they go ahead and rent, say, an extra bedroom as an STR within their home? Or the entire property? Essentially, it would be a sublease. What about companies or associations or LLCs? Those are other forms of allowing certain individuals to establish an STR. And as I mentioned, some HOAs and some property owners already prohibit them. So how do we permit them? Once we've established in what form are we going to permit these? Or are we going to permit or have a registration? Is it going to be ministerial, meaning the director of planning will approve such a use? Or are we going to have it as a discretionary approval, a conditional use permit or some sort of different discretionary approval if we set up parameters such as time or location limits and they want to exceed those? Should we have them come before the Planning Commission for approval? Those structures that are within non-residential zones, should they have discretionary approval? Or if there's some form of appeal? So those are the types of permits. And with that, I would like to introduce Mr. Frank Feng, who is our Business License Director, who will be speaking to you about transient occupancy taxes and business license.
Thank you, Maria. TOT, the transit occupancy tax. The reason we always talk about this, and Melissa was talking about this, because we can collect this tax from those short-term rental. So currently, City of Hawthorne has 12% of the TOT, which means the 12% will be charged on the gross proceeds from those hotels and motels, including the short-term rental. So currently, we have for last year we have about 6 million revenue from TOT, and the reason we have those is because we have 23 hotels and motels. In total, we have 1,805 rooms among those. So on average, it's about 3,300 for each room that we can collect from the TOTs. And as Oscar mentioned before, there are TOTs already there, and if we regulate them, that means we can collect the TOT. And if we don't regulate them, they're just there. And in this case, we cannot collect any rent. Or we cannot collect any TOTs. It's because if we don't regulate them, we cannot formally collect them.
Thank you, Frank. So as Frank mentioned, the TOTs, if we do regulate them, we would have the ability to collect these revenues, and it could either be done through either or by the hosting platform or the individual to collect the TOTs for the city. One of the things we want to talk about is the performance standards, and I think here all of us will probably speak about some of these things here. So the TOT, as Frank mentioned, the property and the building must be approved for a residential use. What we don't want to see is a garage become an STR when it was not approved or built for that. We don't want a shed to become an STR when those were built to store items. They were not built to host people to stay in them for a weekend or a day. We're proposing allowing staff to inspect the property upon reasonable advance notice, for example, 24 hours. We looked at parking. So do we continue with the current municipal code parking standards? Or do we create new parking standards? The parking standards for single-family homes are 2 spaces within a garage, and typically 2 open air spaces is what a typical single-family home does. Larger developments, such as apartments, the current code For single to one bedroom requires 2 spaces per unit. 3 bedrooms requires 3 spaces per unit, and it goes on in that manner. But a lot of these apartments that we have currently in the city do not meet those regulations because they were built before these regulations came into effect, and they were stricter in terms of parking. Do we want to regulate the minimum number of nights per stay? What about the maximum number of days permitted per calendar year per STR? Do we want to go anywhere from 30 to 180 days? And this is where those special discretionary approvals come in. If you decide, say, 120 days, if they want to host further than that, do they have to come in and request permission to host more days? Do we want to allow multiple bookings for the same time period? For example, if you have a 5-bedroom home, are you going to allow 4 different people to rent each room separately? That's what we mean by multiple bookings. So we have to be very clear if we're going to allow this. Special events. Oscar mentioned the issues that may occur with noise, trash, and disruption to the neighborhood, which Melissa had mentioned, such as renting a huge house for weddings or birthdays, filming maybe. So that could be a problem as well. So these are some performance standards that we're mentioning because they are things that we need to look at and regulate if you tell us that you want to permit STRs. So we mentioned noise. Do we want quiet hours? Do we follow the current municipal code? The current municipal code states that between 10 p.m. and 7 a.m., you cannot exceed 50 dBAs, so 50 decibel. Between 7 a.m. and 10 p.m., it goes a little higher, you can't exceed 60. So do we want new, or do we continue with the same one? We definitely need to make sure we state no amplified music. That's very important because that will definitely go beyond the decibel points. And one thing I do want to mention, that even though it says the time between 10 and 7 a.m., the decibel level is this much. If there are calls for the police will come out, and it doesn't matter if it's 8 p.m. If it's loud and it's disrupting the neighborhood, they will shut down the party or whatever is occurring. Trash. Do we want, where are they going to locate the trash cans? Do they need more trash cans? How many trash cans depending on the unit size? Do they need more pickup schedules? One very important performance standard that we do want to see is contact information for any complaints. This number must be available 24/7. It could be either an individual or a property management, depending on what type of STR we permit. What about notification to immediate neighbors that this property will be an STR? So do we mail notification? So application requirements. Permissions. If you're a tenant, we suggest they must obtain approval from the property owner if they are permitted to have an STR. Going back to that example that I gave, if I'm renting a home, I want to rent the extra bedroom as an STR. I'm essentially subleasing it just for a day or two or a week, but I must obtain approval from the property owner. Condominiums, they must obtain approval from the HOAs. 360 doesn't permit it, so they would not give the approval. What about pre-permitting inspections? That's important. You want to make sure that the building that is being rented meets all of the requirements of the Building and Safety Code, at least so that it's safe. For instance, do they need smoke detectors? Those sorts of things. the reporting requirements, and this is where it's important also for finance. Quarterly reports of what is being rented when and where, how much, so we know how much to TOT to collect as well. So where do we obtain that from, the hosting platform or the individual? So I will introduce Melissa again.
I'll talk a little bit about penalties. So, presuming we would be directed to draft some sort of an ordinance, just like any ordinance, there are penalties. All these standards that we've talked about, which all the things that Maria mentioned are things that we've found in other ordinances from other cities. They would be standards, and if they were violated, they would be subject to penalties. And some of the typical penalties that you would see are administrative citations. We have the ability to do that. You can be cited criminally. It can be an infraction or a misdemeanor. We'd have to talk about what we want to do. It could be subject to a civil injunction or penalties should a property, for example, continue to operate in violation of our performance standards. That is an option that we would have. And something that we saw that a lot of cities did do is automatic revocations. So they would have a permitting process for these short-term rentals, but if they reached a third offense, violating the trash provision or noise or otherwise, once they hit the third, they would have their permit revoked, and then they would not be able to operate for the remainder of the year, and sometimes even for longer. So, like any ordinance, you could place these types of penalties on individuals that do not adhere to the requirements that are contained in that ordinance.
And with that, our next step is for the Planning Commission to ask us any questions you may have or to provide feedback to staff to create an STR ordinance.
And maybe before we have the questions from the commission, let me just try to summarize everything that we've talked about, because I know it's been a lot of information. You know, short-term rentals can be a problem, but often they're just a natural part of your community and you don't even know they're there. You know, I've teasingly been talking to the staff that, you know, if your grandma had somebody staying over with her and it just looked like it was, you know, an aunt or a friend and it didn't create any problem, as a neighbor, you wouldn't have any problem with that. It would be perfectly fine. But if, however, somebody had a second house and they rented it to a group of, you know, 10 football enthusiasts who are now here because we have a stadium next door, and they decide to have a rip-roaring party and they're up till 3 o'clock in the morning, if I were a neighbor, I'd probably be concerned with that because I wouldn't know who to call, what to do. You know, it would be very disruptive to the neighborhood. So how do you try to create the balance? And that's what a lot of the cities have been doing recently. They've been looking at ordinances that still provide property owners and tenants an opportunity to have a rental income, to conduct a small business, but still make sure it's not really infringing upon the residential character of neighborhoods, and also not unfairly restricting or infringing upon our hotels and motels who are running legitimate commercial buildings. One of the things that Oscar mentioned is that he's been finding more and more apartments that are being used for short-term rentals. Well, why are they doing that? They can actually make more money on a day-to-day rental than they can if they rent it for a month. Plus, they tend to have such quick turnover that they don't really have tenant issues in terms of having to work with that tenant. If there's any type of you know, failure to pay or anything else, they're in and out very quickly. They don't have a firm tenancy where you have to do an eviction process. You can get them out pretty quickly. But we've had some properties that are being used for short-term rentals that, I think, Oscar, you found a few properties where parking is a little bit of a question.
Yes. There's, as we know, there's a parking issue in Hawthorne, and there's a lot of
Really? Yes.
There's one property that I have right now that I'm dealing with that is in an area where it's only one-side parking. So parking is a major issue. And that's how I found out about the issue of the short-term rentals, because some of the residents complain about just the flow of traffic, just constant people coming in, out, people parking on the street, taking up public street parking for them. So that became one of the issues, is that some of the residents are bringing that to our attention, that there's just a flow of traffic and it's affecting the parking in the area.
So kind of as an analogy, there are things that we often expect in our neighborhoods that sometimes you just have to deal with a little extra parking. If people have kids that are growing up and they park on the street or they take all the available parking on the property, so be it. But when you start having a business and now there's more and more demand for the parking and it's starting to infringe upon the neighbors, that's something you might want to look at, right? So there could be performance standards where we require at least some parking to be available on site, or they're not eligible for a short-term rental. An analogy would be like daycare centers. If you have a large daycare center where you have, 8 to 14 kids, we do require that there's at least one parking stall for one of the employees, and also a parking stall available for the parents to be able to come in and drop off and pick up their kids, right? So that way you're minimizing some of the impacts on the neighborhood. You can do something similar with short-term rentals, right? So cities that have also looked at, if they are going to have a short-term rental, how do you best provide, in quotes, the policing of the short-term rental? If the host is not there, if the person who has control of the property is not there, you have these parties, or you just have something that happens, maybe there's an accident, nobody knows who to contact, what to do. A lot of what we're seeing in some of the ordinances, and I think both Melissa and Maria, you've seen that a lot of the cities, especially like Santa Monica, I think, have required the short-term rentals to be hosted.
Yes, they have required the short-term rentals to be hosted.
Yeah, in fact, there were a lot of cities that's why they made the distinction between vacation rentals, actually, and not just hosted and unhosted. Some have just said we don't want vacation rentals at all, because vacation rentals it isn't their primary residence. They just kind of keep it for that purpose, and they can do it throughout the whole year. There are cities that the ones that allowed it actually put caps on it, no more than 180 days. It probably is the most that I saw.
Right.
So yeah, they will certainly do that. That's
So that is very common.
it is.
Yes.
Right. And so that would go to, for example, when we have the apartments, where we have a 10-unit apartment building that's all being used for short-term rentals currently, that's now converted to a motel, right, where you don't have on-site management, you don't really know what's happening there. We know at least one apartment building that is currently doing that, correct?
Yes.
Right. And so you do wonder if that's appropriate, but also from a housing perspective, the commission has talked recently about our obligations to provide housing. We have the regional housing needs assessment. We have a housing element that says our goal is to provide long-term permanent housing that meets all of the income levels of our community. When you start having a business activity that's taking away from that permanent housing, that may be contrary to your housing element. So something to consider as well. Then the issue of whether or not we're receiving the community benefits from people operating these businesses. Frank had mentioned that we have transit occupancy tax, which you're saying currently it's about $3,000 per.
It's
room?
about 3,300 per year per room.
Okay, but now if we had a short-term rental, so this is being operated out of somebody's home, what would your expectation be for value?
It will be about the same amount. Will be 3,500 a year.
Yeah, but that would be assuming that it's being rented every single day, right? And what we were just saying is that what we're seeing from a lot of cities is they don't want it to be a permanent business. But that's up to the city ultimately to decide if you're going to create an ordinance. But I would say probably for most short-term rentals, they're not every day. They tend to be primarily on the weekends, during holidays, maybe a little bit more in the summertime when people are traveling. So you may see that maybe it's $1,000 or maybe it's only $500. Maybe it's the occasional time that the person will rent it out. So the income won't be as much as we would see from our hotels or motels, but it certainly would provide some financial benefit to the city, which then could be used to upkeep, the various things that visitors would like to see within the community. But in terms of the process, the workshop today is really just to talk about what we know, what we think, what we feel in terms of short-term rentals and how they may be considered for Hawthorne. And then ultimately, as we take testimony from the community, we'd like to have some direction from the Planning Commission in terms of how to write an ordinance. We already have some thoughts of what we think would be appropriate, so we think we could turn this around fairly quickly. Our goal is to have an ordinance to you probably by the first meeting in December, I think is what we talked about, right, Maria? Okay, and I think
is correct.
Melissa's already working on it, so
I
we
believe
already
so.
have the kind of an outline of what
Yes.
could be within an ordinance. But generally, I don't think we want to overburden the process. I don't think it's necessary to have every applicant come before the Planning Commission. I think most of it could be very administrative, very similar to like a business license, right, Frank?
Yes.
Right.
It's very similar.
Yeah. So a lot of it would be based on performance levels. And once we're able to check the boxes, we're able to confirm that they can meet those standards, the majority of the time you would never even hear from them. But there may be some outliers if somebody wants to operate more than a certain number of days or there's something unusual where they need to have an exemption or an exception, then that's something we may want to consider a discretionary process. But I think just to summarize, short-term rentals, while we've had some minor problems, for the most part, there hasn't been a lot of complaints. So it seems like there's an opportunity to provide for a regulatory approach that would allow for some business activities by our residents, as long as it's not negatively impacting the neighborhoods. And so with that, we would turn it back to the chair and back to the Planning Commission. This is a workshop, so once you have any of your questions that you'd like to answer, we ask that you open up comments to the community, and then you can bring it back to the commission and provide direction.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Very nice presentation. Commissioners, would you like to make a comment? Start with D1.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a lot of information. I mean, first of all, your slide on why regulate. I mean, I think all those reasons that you provided there, they're very valid, and they're important for us to keep in mind. One item I like to start with, just as a question to staff and maybe just for discussion, is let's say an owner has a secondary home and they want to do short-term rentals. Why would they ever? It seems contradictory to try to do short-term rentals in a secondary home and also allow it part of the time to be regular housing stock, right? It doesn't seem like those two can go together. And my concern is limiting even more the shortage of housing stock when it's a secondary home. When it's a primary home, I really don't see an issue with being able to rent that as much as you can, as the owner wants. But yeah, okay.
Thank you.
So I don't know if you guys want to talk about that and maybe.
So I think to summarize your question, you're suggesting that if it's a second home, which is what I think, Maria, you were classifying as a vacation rental,
That is correct. It's
Right.
second, third,
whatever it might be, but it's not the primary residence, so the person's
Correct.
not living there the majority of time.
Correct.
So you're raising the concern of whether that could be an impact on loss of housing if it's being used just for a short-term rental.
Correct, because I really don't see a benefit to the owner using it for both. It's either one or the other.
And I think that's something that the commission could ultimately discuss, is whether or not you have a preference for primary residential uses, having short-term rentals, and not allowing vacation rentals, which is just somebody has an extra apartment or house, whatever it might be.
Yeah, I believe it should be owner occupied. If we are going to allow the use, it should be owner occupied.
I don't think a second home should be allowed to do it. Because, I have a second home, but I don't rent it out at all. Mostly because it's a family home and I decided I didn't want to be a landlord. And why would I want somebody to come in there and spend a week
Or a day.
or a day and go
You'd be doing a lot of laundry.
somewhere else, and then I have to go to the trouble of, cleaning it up and so forth and so on. And I don't think it's beneficial to the owner of the property when they could rent it to someone full time. I think it'd be better, but just my comment.
I do have a few questions. The first, the operating Airbnbs that are currently happening in Hawthorne, has there been a penalty that was set on them, or have they been penalized in any way?
Yes, they've been issued administrative citations.
Okay. So with the citations, is it like they have to, it's monetary, they have to pay money for operating a business that is not allowed in the Hawthorne, or how does that go?
Yes, they will have to pay the penalty now. If they
Yes.
do, there are delinquencies. If they pass the 30 days, they are given 30 days, an administrative citation to pay the fine, or else there will be some fees that are added to that citation.
Thank you.
Right, but just to clarify that, typically what happens first is we issue a notice of violation. So we basically warn them,
Yes.
that you're doing something that's not permitted. If they're not paying attention and they're not willing to comply, that's when the code enforcement officer would start issuing citations. So I think at this point, how many properties have you issued a citation to?
As of right now, 2. Those are
Right.
the two that I am aware of. As I mentioned, on Airbnb and these websites, they don't
There
give
are
an
other things.
address, and we try our best to kind of look at pictures and try to look at a street view or something that we're familiar with the property or the area. Unfortunately, we're not given much sometimes. Usually, it's just the interior of the unit or the bedroom that they're renting.
Thank you. And my second question, I mean, you did mention we do have a plethora of hotels. I don't understand, I mean, if we have that many hotels here that are beautiful and available, is there a need to actually allow for this?
Well, I believe there is need because even though we have enough hotels, but people are still trying to find either they are cheaper or maybe they are more like home feeling. Yeah. And sometimes when during the, like, for example, we have the new stadium at El Segundo, so when there are a whole bunch of tourists come here, the hotels are not sufficient, so they need additional.
Thank you. And my last question before my comment is on the page, on the slide that stated where is an STR permitted and should they be permitted residential, commercial, or industrial, I don't see the need of why we would actually allow something in a commercial or industrial zone. Why would we allow for a huge space to be rented short term and not be aware of what's happening inside? And I mean, I think it's, I mean, humbly, maybe it's just inviting trouble. Should it be allowed in commercial and industrial?
Well, typically, the homes that are in commercial and industrial are already considered legal non-conforming. So they don't conform to the requirements of the code, meaning that we wouldn't allow residential if it wasn't there. So the only city who's allowing it, and that would be Hermosa Beach, and that's that pilot program. They're not even allowing in the residential zones at all. So they're going the opposite way.
Right.
So they're allowing the homes that are already built non-conforming in commercial and industrial areas.
Correct. The only thing I don't know is if they're actually non-conforming in their code.
Oh, okay.
That's the only thing.
But I would
yeah.
suggest that that's not a typical model.
It's not a typical
Right.
model.
I mean, what most cities are finding is that the short-term rentals can be incorporated within existing neighborhoods as long as there's good standards. My concern would be if you have a legal non-conforming house that happens to be in an industrial area, do we really want people who are unfamiliar with the neighborhood coming into an area that may not be the most appropriate, right? So what I would see in most cities' ordinances is that they only allow it for properties that are otherwise allowed for residential use. That would typically mean your residential zones, but it could also mean if you have a mixed-use residential zone where it's commercial with residential, that you could allow it there as well. But if it's 100% commercial or 100% industrial zone district, you wouldn't
Right.
allow for the intensification of a residential use that's non-conforming.
Okay,
That makes
so
sense?
Yeah, I mean, if we were to allow it,
Makes
I
sense.
definitely would not recommend it for it to be in commercial industrial. It would just be in residential or mixed use. And I mean, if I'm understanding correctly, if it's happening anyway in places that we don't know or we can't locate the house, and regulating this is going to generate more income to this city, I mean, I may not see such a huge problem in doing it if it's happening anyway, and it may continue to happen without us being aware. But if we do regulate and still people are operating without permits or without coming to the planning department and announcing that this house is going to be used for a short-term rental, how do we police that if we still don't have the addresses, or how is that going to be regulated?
Well, I'll let Melissa and Oscar address that.
Well, one possibility is, like in Santa Monica, I mentioned that they had placed some requirements. They had prohibited these platforms. The obligations they were placing were on the actual hosting platforms, not the individuals. We kind of are looking at
It's both.
two-prong, having it, the obligation be upon both. But what the hosting platforms were challenging was the fact that the city was saying you don't list the ones that are not allowed, that don't have licenses, basically. So that was a fight, but that case was won by the city. So that's one possibility. We can place some obligations on the hosting platforms to remove those, for example, that are not licensed, and to provide us, they are the reporting requirements. Tell us who you have that are placing the advertisements on your platforms so that we can check it on our list to see who is licensed and who is not. And those that are not, we would have, you know, we would have an address at that point to be able to look at. So that's one way.
Okay.
Yeah. I don't know, Oscar, if you have any other.
Yeah, and actually on Airbnb, on their website, they actually have the host's information sometimes, or an email, so you can always contact them through there, ask where the location is, and maybe not say who you are at first, and then don't want to give that away. But then that's a way of trying to, you know, finding out where the location might be.
But I think the first line of defense, though, is making sure that the hosting platforms are required to share information.
Yeah.
So it would be great if they wouldn't allow somebody to post on their website if they don't have the proper licenses from us. But even if they do, if they're required to report everyone who is their customer, then we can cross-check check between code enforcement and business license to see, are they properly licensed and do they meet the performance standards? Right? And then ultimately, when we have performance standards, it still means that we have to check occasionally. So, for example, if we say that you have to have 2 parking spaces available, and now all of a sudden they've decided to have an inoperable vehicle park in one of those spaces, well, then one of their spaces is no longer available. So we'd have to continually have a dialogue. And probably what you would end up doing is having an annual license, just like with your business license, it's done annually. And that could cause a requirement for us to at least check and make sure that they appear to be in full compliance.
And I mean, the last thing that I have to say is I do agree that I would only have it with the hosted, not unhosted. I mean, I do agree with my fellow commissioners. The unhosted, yeah, it's much harder to regulate when you have someone on site, and it's so much easier to
I agree with
regulate.
that, yeah.
And through the chair, and speaking of hosted sites, in our code, units between 1 and 4, properties with 1 up to 4 units, we consider those as single-family dwellings. And if the host lives on one of the units, we would define it as hosted.
Right, because the
If-
property would be
yes.
hosted.
Correct.
I understand
The
that.
property,
Yes.
okay.
So yeah, there's
Just
the
wanted to
property owner
clarify
is
that.
on
the
that
site,
lot. Yes.
On that lot,
Yes.
correct.
Now, something that we didn't talk about is what about apartment units? And so,
Owner.
you know, I think if there isn't a full-time on-site manager, I don't think that we should allow any type of rentals
On apartment units.
on the property. Yeah, if there is, maybe it's something that there could be maybe 25% of the units or something like that could be
6%.
allowed. But if there is no full-time, it just we're asking for problems if we start allowing that type of rental without management.
I agree.
Makes sense.
I mean, I think that they probably shouldn't have it at all in apartments, because then it's going to turn into like a hotel type use. I think it's probably best to have it maybe in condos and residential, and also a lot of apartment complex. They don't allow for like subleasing anyway, so you know that might hinder them from doing it regardless.
And I mean, one of the things that we read is it has to be by the owner. It can't be by the leasee, right? Or how?
Depends on your ordinance,
Correct.
Oh,
right? It's a menu of choices.
okay.
And so depending on which options you choose, there are other things that may pair with it. So for example, if you said that a person who is living in an apartment and decides that they want to rent out their second bedroom as a short-term rental, you would most likely have a requirement that they obtain the property owner's permission,
That's what I was going
right?
to say. Yeah.
And then you may place some limitations that they can only do it if there's available parking, right? So if this is a 2-bedroom unit, but it's an old apartment and they only have 1 parking stall,
Can't be allowed.
you may be creating a parking impact in the neighborhood. So again, performance standards combined with the opportunity for short-term rental probably start narrowing what you can do, even if it was an apartment. But you can decide as well, if you don't think apartments are appropriate, you can just say that you don't allow short-term rentals in apartments.
Yeah, and I think most owners do not allow subleasing. I mean, for most apartments, that's
correct,
That's what
yeah.
I know. They do not allow subleasing. So if they have to be informed and if they allow it, that's different. But I mean, with the apartments, I am on the edge. I really maybe maybe it would be wiser not to allow them in apartments.
I think I agree with that as
Yeah.
well. I mean, I think if in the future, maybe in a year or something, we
Can revisit.
can revisit that. But I
see
think
how
to
this
start
help-
off with, I agree with that. Yeah. And also the subleasing,
Yes.
not allowing the renter
The
to
lease- yeah.
to lease or to do short-term rentals.
Well, Mr. Chair, at this point, you might want to open it up to the community because you have about a dozen or so people out here, and I'm sure they all have some comments or some opinions that they would like to share.
And would appreciate it if you would keep your comments to just 3 minutes. Just
And please make sure you
line up
provide your
behind the
name.
podium. State your name, please.
Lucy Ravitch. I do operate one, and I've been operating one for over 5 years. I obtained a license in 2014, have been able to renew that license, and I pay TOT every quarter. And so far, it's been a very pleasant experience. I have a triplex where I live in the front, and it's a 1-bedroom, 1-bath unit. And actually, it's the last one listed on your examples. So I've had a lot of people visiting. Many people are families that want to go to this Napa Center. It's across the street. It's for health and wellness for their children. They stay for 2 or 3 weeks. And then I've also had vacationers that come for various reasons to visit family, to go to a wedding, some people for work or conferences. And then I've also had even honeymooners or people celebrating anniversaries. I think to note, why would people vote or go to a short-term rental? A lot of people want to cook for themselves. They want to be able to have a full kitchen, and also the homey environment. Like they get a little bit of a backyard with us and one parking spot. I do want to mention that I was like, wow, there's lots of decisions with all this. But the more regulations you make, the harder it is to regulate. So I just want to let you know that also sometimes if you make so many requirements, it might scare off people that otherwise would want to come forward. Yes, I'd like to operate this thing. Oh, there's all these things. So you might want to be aware that try not to be too scary with all these requirements.
Come on, Halloween's coming up. We want to wear something.
Another thing is I actually do operate all year long because it is a unit in my property, and so it's fully furnished. It has everything. I mean, occasionally I let my family use it, but for the most part, I am booked about 28 days out of every month for an average. And I do bring in about $3,300 a year in transient occupancy tax over the last 5.5 years. But I would like to continue with my business and having my business license. I got the letter that's saying as of January 1st, I'm not able to be renewed. So I have blocked off my calendar starting January 1st. But I would like to open it up because lots of people are planning their summer vacations and different things like that. But I know things take time, but if whoever has jurisdiction over letting me continue to operate for at least one more year, it would be wonderful if they could let me renew my license. And yes, I think that's it. And I don't think anybody who operates is really trying to hide anything. So if we do put these regulations in place, I think should be pretty easy for somebody to obtain the business license, pay the quarterly tax. I mean, they need to do it for their own tax purposes, so they should be able to do it. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Ruben Sanchez, North Hawthorne Community Association. First of all, we're comparing apples and oranges, apartments with homeowners. That's something that as you can see, we have homeowners here that are affected deeply, especially with the Airbnb issue. Apartments as a whole, obviously, is not an income source for them because if not, we would have had all these lawyers and such and people up here saying, hey, or their minions, their developer minions up here talking about we need to do this and so on. So it's not an income source for them. The people who are being affected are the homeowners, for sure. That's plain and simple. I don't Airbnb myself. I've gone to one. I was in Palm Springs. One thing I think they failed to mention a bit is that before you make your choice, look into Airbnb. look to see the restrictions, because it's very restricted. It's not somebody can just off the street can come in and say, hey, you know, let's party, woo, you know, nothing like that. You know, they come in, they're vetted, they're looked at, you know, they get in trouble. By the law, it's insured, fully insured by these places. You have to, it's not somebody just coming off the street into a stranger's home. You know, please look at this closely, because you will affect and punish a lot of the homeowners. And that's what we don't want. Once again, apartments hid behind homeowners, and it affected the homeowners of our city. And that's what we don't want. We want to open the doors. This is, you know, later on in the future, I wouldn't mind Airbnb in my home, you know, because that might bring some extra income, you know. And that's something that people, you know, when we retire or so, you know, what we can do, you know, you can say, oh yeah, somebody hosted or non-hosted. If it's non-hosted, it really doesn't matter. Like I said, they're very strict. They're restricted, and they're checked. I guess their driver's license, where they live. It's not somebody, like I said, nobody, a stranger. Now, the point I wanted to make is that the presentation's beautiful. I like it. The only thing is not consistent. The example here is not consistent. No offense, please, Maria, but it's not consistent because you're comparing the city of Hawthorne, where Santa Monica, Hermosa Beach, Manhattan Beach. They're destination areas. They're destination cities. We're not. People come here, families come here because they're going to go visit families. Because they're going to go out, and from here, they're going to go somewhere, visit Hollywood or something like that. So they're peaceful people. There's no party animals coming over here. What are they going to go rave at the Hawthorne Mall? You know? It's like, we're not a destination area. There's nothing to be afraid of. If you want to restrict the apartments, go right ahead, man. I know you do a great job, Oscar, you know. And but you have to give the homeowners the opportunity in the future, even though if it's hosted or not hosted. If it's not hosted, like I said, a lot of these homes, like I can leave somewhere. Hey, who knows? Maybe I'll go live somewhere in Barcelona and then just want to rent a house for a while or something. But give that option back to the homeowners. That's what we want. To have that power, to understand that the property that we purchased a long time ago means something. Not that it's going to be dictated by someone else. So in regards to, like I said, destination, we're not a destination area. And take that into consideration. I know we talk about the stadium and so on, but still, you haven't had any issues. You know, so take that into consideration. Look over the Airbnbs and the other places. I'm not too familiar, like I said. But look into it. Look at the restrictions. Talk to somebody from there if you can. Don't just make up your mind and say, hey, you know, I want to do my laundry. So it's not like that, Mr. Smith. Yeah, make sure you do your research before you let all these homeowners down, because that's who you're punishing, the homeowners. And I like the way you think, Maria, in regards of focusing on issues, and we need to start focusing on the quality of life, because all the neighbors behind the Hawthorne Mall in the RFK, their quality of life has been damaged for many years. For many, many years. And I hope we can start working together, and I hope all the homeowners here remember this day, that the homeowners were having a workshop, but then the quality of life of the people around the Hawthorne Mall and the RFK, there's no workshop there, okay? Thank you very much. Ruben Sanchez, God bless. Have a great day.
Thank you very much.
Good evening. My name is Valentin Hernandez. I am a Airbnb host, and I really appreciate the opportunity for us to speak and to tell our experience so far. And I just want to take a little different approach as a couple people before me. The way I see it is we are like mid to low income families here. And this is a great opportunity for us to create a little bit of wealth, like owning a home, having this extra income, and it's a really good way to help our children, right? And we have, so I don't have to look for a second job and leave my kids unattended. So now I have that little extra source and spend time with them and also create a little bit of wealth, because you know, most of us, we don't own anything. And I know a lot of people are making a lot of money in this city, especially developers. They come and they build all these apartment buildings, make their money, and then go to live in Palos Verdes. And we are the ones living in the city, and I guess like suffering of these crowdedness of with the parking, with the trash, with all of that. So we want. I mean, I guess like in my case, I'm just took the little opportunity that we had with the Airbnb for this extra income, and it's been working great so far. So I feel blessed of don't having to look for a second job. And as I was checking the presentation, I totally agree. We need some regulations as well, but do not over-regulate it. Let's just go with the. I mean, if there's been any issues, address those first and regulate some other minor things. Don't try to do a lot at the beginning, and we can just tweak it as we go. Are there any issues with trash? If there's any issues with parking, we address those as they come. Don't try to just do everything at once, and that would be my suggestion. And also for the vacation home, I mean, it is really nice that some of you have an extra property and you don't use it. So that wouldn't make sense to me, having a second home and not making money of it. So if I want to have an extra home, it's going to be an investment, and it's because you work for it. You took care of your credit. You were able to get a loan. You were able to put everything together to acquire another property. And if there is a possibility to give it a different use where you can make a little bit more money, I mean, I will take it. So just another thing to consider, not just because you feel like I don't think that would be a good idea. Let's just take that opportunity away from people who just try to make something out of almost nothing. That's all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
Can I ask the speaker a question, please?
Sure, of course.
Okay, Mr. Valentine, if I can just or Mr. Hernandez, if I can ask a question. So you indicated that you're currently doing a short-term rental.
Yes.
Are you renting rooms from your home while you're there? Are you a hosted short-term rental?
It's legally it's a duplex where we live, and we rent the other unit.
Okay, so you're hosted because you're still in one of the units.
Yes.
And you're just renting out the second. Okay, thank you. Just wanted
Yes.
to clarify
and
that.
I was considering maybe getting another one. I mean, if it was possible, and because I see it would be a good venue for us to acquire another property, have something for the children.
Okay. And you're saying that if you have the second property, you'd want to use that as a short-term rental rather than just renting it?
Yes, but I would do it if it's less like half a mile from where we live, so we could manage it. I mean, and obviously doing it responsibly and providing a good experience also for our host.
Okay, thank you.
I mean, for our guest.
For your guests. Okay.
Hi, good evening, everybody. My name is Chen. I'm a local resident. So I own a triplex here, and I am also a host. In fact, I'm a new host. So before I become a host, I didn't know that we have such a rule. But I'm here because I want to speak up for guests. Myself, the reason why I start hosting is because I am a frequent Airbnb user. When I go travel, I use Airbnb. I think you mentioned as why would people choose Airbnb instead of hotel? Let me tell you why. I have kids. So with Airbnb, it's so much easier. I can cook, I can make food for my kids, but in the hotel, I don't have such amenities. So I want to provide all these opportunities for people with family. So a lot of guests come to my home. I have to say, they are great. I never had a trouble with any single guest so far. In fact, they are better than my long-term tenants. Before my long-term tenants, they can have parties because they will have their birthday parties, their family reunions. I will have a whole bunch of cars parked in the streets. Instead of these travelers, they are coming, visiting their families, or just for one day because of the flight transit. They don't even have cars. They take Uber here. A lot of them, they only use one single parking instead of two, or even more, because they are just renting a two-bedroom apartment. They have 4 people. Just one car is enough. So to me, a parking issue is less when I'm comparing to a long-term staying tenant. And when I see these tenants or Airbnb guests, they're super good quality, like they said. There are so many restrictions for the guests when they're booking the site. And as a host, we can screen them before I even approve. When they have bad reviews, I simply don't approve them. I only approve those ones with good reviews. People traveling all around the world, and they really appreciate me and respect our house. They're very quiet. Also, I put on so many rules, house rules, like quiet time, like trash. No single guest had been disobeying my rules. They're just great. I really look at them are good quality travelers. In fact, a lot of people come to here. Hawthorne City is new to them, and they saw how beautiful it is. And I actually kind of had a couple of travelers. They said they want to move here and buy a house here. So I really appreciate the chances that we as a host that we're providing for a lot of people visiting here. In fact, like they said, a lot of our families, most of them are families with kids, or just like a one day because of the flight delay. I just feel like this is a need, such a need here. So I really appreciate if you guys will provide this opportunity for a lot of people like us. I really want to say, yeah, please give all the hosts a chance. So thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Bernita King, and I agree with many of my, didn't know they were here, but many of the other commentators before me. However, I'd also like to bring up the concern. I don't currently do short-term rental. I have apartments, so I don't have that. But my concern would be what would happen if you had foreign students, someone is hosting students from a foreign country or something in their home. It seems like to me if you that this might get into a restrictive situation. If you had persons who might be nurses or other professionals who are coming in for more than 30 days, but certainly less than a year, that kind of a thing. So I just think that there has to be a broader view as to what the use can be used for. I agree with regulations. I think anybody who's doing any kind of renting, whether it's long-term or permanent, you tend to have rules because you don't want to have a lot of problems with your property just between different persons who are renting in the same unit. But I think if you get into short-term, the idea, I heard something about the hosted. I really think that, again, if it's unhosted, we're talking about adults. We're not talking about renting to children or persons under age 18 or someone who would not otherwise be liable or responsible in any other circumstance if it was long-term renting. So I just think that we got to be considerate, as someone mentioned before, about keeping in mind that we are landlords or we are adults. We are finding other ways maybe to make some income. We're being considerate of all the other things and other people, but it's not something that should just be so restricted as I have a second or third home or whatever, and I would not want to have that kind of restriction. Thank you. I have property in another area in the state of California and outside of California, and this whole idea of short-term rental or being able to do Airbnb, which I've never done, but the idea of doing short-term rental in other areas seems to strike a fancy. Northern California, keep that in mind.
Thank you very much. Anyone else?
Hi, good evening. My name is Lena Hernandez. As a host, part of our success is based on the ratings that we get from the travelers. So we do what we can to attract them. One of them being investing in beautifying our properties. So whether it be the landscaping or renovating the outside, painting, that beautifies the community. And when someone does that, it tends to motivate the neighbors to also improve their properties. So again, I feel it benefits the entire block, the community, and it improves the property values. And with that, we also contribute to maintaining the public and private areas clean. In our case, we live in a dead end, and people dump trash there all the time, bulky items. So we're on top of it. My husband has gone out there personally with a broom to sweep the streets or to call the city to pick up that bulky trash. So we're on top of it because we want our area to be attractive. We also invest in the interior of the property, obviously, from furnishings. And so when we obtained a license and then a few months later we were told it was not going to be renewed, that is going to be a hit for us. What are we supposed to be doing now with those furnishings? I personally believe that because we obtained a business license, that it should be considered and we should be grandfathered in, if anything. And well, no, just requesting that maybe that be taken into consideration. Let's see. Personally, we have not had any issues with any of our travelers. We do have rules and everyone has followed them. None of our neighbors have ever complained or stated anything. As far as parking, that's an amenity that draws people. We get that asked a lot, the people that do have cars, if we offer parking on the property, and we do. But it is true, most do Uber, so it's not, we're not contributing to the parking issue in the city. So that's it. I also agree that, please, if you want to regulate it, but don't prohibit it. That is a source of income for us. And again, on a larger scale, I do believe it benefits the community. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Is there anyone else?
I'm sorry, can you speak into the mic,
Yes,
please?
come to
I
the
can- I'm
microphone,
sorry.
please.
My name is Olivia Adams, and I just help the ones with disability. They only get $971 a month, and they get, I think, $117 to $140 for food stamps. And I get them from churches, and they're trying to get Section 8 or whatever. And as soon as they get an opportunity, they move on. But, it's not fair for them to be taxed all this money when they don't barely have enough to make it. And I just try to provide them maybe 2 or 3 months or whatever time it takes for them to find more permanent housing. So I think you should consider that as well.
Okay, thank you. No one else? What would you suggest?
If I may, through the chair, can I make a comment? I'm sorry. If I may, of course, we're here to serve. So, I want you to know that the 5 of us are here to serve you. So whatever benefits the city and benefits the citizens of the city is what we try to do. So in my opinion, having heard what they have to say brings a completely different perspective. So when it comes to hosted and unhosted, if hosted did not have a cap, and if hosted did not have a cap and unhosted had a cap, maybe that would be a compromise of how many days per year they can rent it if it's not hosted. And the ones that are hosted, I don't see any reason for capping it. The tenant is always going to be there. I don't see any reason that's going to prevent them from maintaining and taking care of it. The point that the young lady brought is actually extremely valid. They are beautifying the city. They are going beyond what we normally would do to make it more attractive for their potential renters to come. And that is a plus to us as a city. And the last thing that I would kindly request is the ones that did go out of their way to ask for licenses. I don't know how long our decision is going to take, but if they could have a grace period maybe until we decide, I don't know if that's an option, because they did it legally, they came through the system, I don't want them to be penalized for a decision that might take a long time for us to make while they did their business legally. So I just hope that it can be considered.
So just really quickly, on the last 2 points that you made, Commissioner, I agree. We definitely should find a way for them to maintain the licenses while the regulations are in place. And then in terms of the hosted and unhosted, I'm on the same page on that as well. What I was talking about earlier was more primary residence versus secondary residence. I'm still the same stance on secondary residences, that we should not allow for short-term rentals on that. But if it's your primary residence, I would even not put a cap on the amount that you could rent it, because I could see people taking half a year off, going to Europe or somewhere else, and having the house empty. So in that case, it would be unhosted, but it's still their primary residence. So I don't see an issue with renting it for that full amount of time. That's all.
I had an idea because I have a lot of questions and comments, and to make this meeting go by smoother, if we can just go through the questions that's in the slides and go through each one, that we can get our opinions on everything. So make sure it's all clear and everybody is on the same page. I believe they start on slide 8.
There we go, commissioners.
I mean, where.
Where?
Where is an STR permitted?
Yeah, that one. So for this one, I feel that it should be based on the actual use that's on the property and not the land use. So meaning if there's a house or residential house on a commercial or an industrial property, that they should be allowed to do short-term rental as long as it's a house.
As long as it's a living quarters or a permitted use.
Yes.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, well, I agree with that.
I agree with
Yeah,
that.
I agree with that. Not,
Yeah.
it like only houses, yeah. Yes.
So just to confirm, so if we have a legal non-conforming house, meaning that we have a house that was, for example, built in an industrial area, and we no longer allow houses to be built in an industrial area, the commission is generally acceptable of having visitors be able to come to that home?
Yes, because it's still, we shouldn't penalize the residents for, the resident for buying, I don't know, 50,
Years ago.
60 years ago when it was allowed, so, yeah.
Right, but it could also be somebody who bought it just last year, too.
I thought once you buy it, it
It
changes
doesn't,
title.
yeah, it doesn't, no, it doesn't run with the ownership of the land, it runs with the use. So for example, if the house was constructed legally and then it became legal non-conforming, so it would no longer be allowed under today's ordinances, the ordinances for the city of Hawthorne allows for continuous use as long as you don't stop it for more than a period of 2 years. So you can have this property sold 1 million times as long as they don't discontinue. So it's just something for you to consider. So it doesn't have to deal with the original investment in the house. It really has to do with it's just legal non-conforming.
As long as it's being used as a residence, yeah, I agree still.
Yeah, I agree with that, and especially because it sounds like we're all on the same page that it should be owner occupied. It's not going to be like a house in a commercial or industrial area, and they're just renting it out constantly for short-term rental. It's
So it's a hosted unit.
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then so the next one.
Well, it's a primary residence, right?
Yeah.
Because
right.
we're going to get into the hosted or
Yes.
non-hosted, but
Okay.
it's the primary residence. That would be the key.
Right, primary residence. So
Right.
not necessarily hosted, but primary residence.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, for the second part, I don't think apartments should be there. Right?
What, the second part, what
With the
type of units?
units may be
Correct.
allowed? I personally don't think apartments should be there. It's much more difficult to regulate. I mean,
I agree, and then the fact that it does diminish the housing stock.
yeah.
I mean, rental prices are astronomical as they are already. So, and based on the amount of units that we're going to have to accommodate in the future because of
Mike.
the amount of units that we have to accommodate in the future because of the
Big element.
Housing element.
housing element, correct. So I think that should be off the table.
And non-conforming structures, as in legal non-conforming, is that what we spoke about when we talked about the commercial and industrial? Yeah. Okay.
Correct, legal non-conforming residential structures.
So that's legal non-conforming or non-conforming?
Legal non-conforming, I
Yeah, and I actually think that's a good clarification because
Yes.
if it's a legal non-conforming, we're talking about land use. So we're talking about a residential use that may not otherwise be allowed in its current zone. If you adopt performance standards, for example, if you say that the house has to have proper exiting, it has to have fire extinguishers and various other things. We're not saying non-conforming structure from that perspective. This is really dealing with the use, legal non-conforming structures.
Correct.
And I think that's what you had discussed before, that you're okay with that as long as it's
Being used
a
as
primary residence.
primary residence.
But I think we shouldn't allow for non-conforming structures, meaning that they don't have a permit for the
Right,
structure.
right.
No, we
'Cause I
wouldn't
think
anyway.
that's-
We wouldn't. I should have actually
No.
written legal non-conforming.
That's what she meant.
So, yeah,
Okay.
Yeah, if somebody has converted a building and made it into a house without having building permits, don't come to us because we're not going to allow it.
No. Okay. Staff inspections?
Condominiums. Sorry, we skipped over condominiums.
Condominium sounds good. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah.
I'm in agreement
Okay.
as well.
I'm sorry.
Condominiums, so that would fall under the same
Oh.
category, as long as they're primary residences.
Okay.
Okay, so maybe I can help just go through the slides just to help get us through it. So the next one is, how do we allow for short-term rentals? So we've already basically said we're not going to deny them. We really want to regulate them. And what I'm hearing from the commission is generally support of primary residency. So it has to be something that is generally occupied by the residents. But you are willing to consider some hosted and unhosted portions.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's
I know.
correct.
Yeah, sorry. I know that maybe my fellow commissioners would not agree with me on this, but I do want to throw it on the table. I mean, how much harm would it be if it was a vacation rental? If it was a home that they bought just for short-term rentals? I mean, can we discuss the pros and cons?
So I have a secondary home, actually.
Okay.
I have a couple of homes, and you would think I would be the first one to say, okay, because when you do vacation rentals or short-term rentals, generally you're able to have a higher income from those properties through short-term rentals than if you rented, long-term. But I have a genuine concern with the as the body, we have to consider the impact not just to individuals that are able to afford multiple homes, but also to the general community that live in the city of Hawthorne. So I think that would have a potential to impact the rental prices in Hawthorne, because the housing stock does diminish. If you look at it to where a person's strictly looking at income, right? You're gonna choose the option that gives you higher income, and so if that option always gives you a higher income guaranteed,
Much less likely
why
to
would
rent
you
it.
rent out for long term? So I believe it has a huge impact. I mean, if the rest of the commissioners feel strongly about doing some sort of pilot program where we look at it only for a very limited amount of time, and we could study how much of that housing income was removed from the market, I think that would be an option. On top of that, the stadium, down the street, that is being built. So once that comes into play, there is going to be a new dynamic that's brought into the whole short-term rentals. Most of the people that are going to be going, not most, but there's going to be a lot of people that just want a short-term rental experience, but want to go to the stadium and have fun, and maybe there's going to be it's going to be less of a family oriented experience for short-term rentals. So, so I'm concerned about that as well.
I mean, I definitely understand your point, and of course, they are gonna try to go for the higher income. But if we, hypothetically speaking, if we try it for a year, say, and cap it at 90 days per year, so that way we're not encouraging them that much, because the income isn't going to be a lot different than actually renting it for the full year. So I don't know if that could be an option. And again, I'm just spitballing here.
So the problem that I see with that is, or the conflict is that if I have a secondary home and I'm capped at 90 days, so that means that you either choose the 90 days, financially it's probably not beneficial to you, as opposed to renting it long term.
Yes. So it would be
I mean,
somewhat of a deterrent, ultimately it might be more feasible to just rent it,
Yeah.
but just to keep it out there. Maybe the house has been listed for rent and it hasn't been rented, and it's been so long, and nobody wants to rent it or live in it full time. And then if you cap it with 90 days, at least we're giving them the option to make money off of it until they find somebody that can rent it full time.
That's a good
You know?
good point. And I think I would still propose that be monitored
Yeah.
to see how much of an impact it has.
Or maybe just allow it for 1 year, like just cap it for 1 year and see how it goes, and then make our final decision in the
Yeah.
pilot.
What do you?
I mean,
guys
I don't
think
know. I'm
about
just
that?
so.
Yeah, I believe you guys both made some great points. I know in our last meeting, we were talking about how California is in a housing crisis, and by making it a complete rental property, it would create more of a housing crisis. But the 90 days, it does sound reasonable. The only thing would be, how would we regulate the 90 days? That would be, the only thing. But it does sound like a good idea to give them, some time in between renting out the property full time. And then I forgot, because I noticed some people in the audience, they were mentioning properties that were being rented out for more than 30 days. So short-term rental is if it's less than 30 days. So that's what we're talking about in our meeting, is for properties that are being rented out for less than 30 days.
So can staff provide a little bit of feedback on the possibility of doing a 90-day max on secondary homes?
We can certainly look into that, because we will have to prepare an ordinance and bring it back to you for a public hearing. And so at that point, we can have some further clarification, maybe identify something we think is appropriate, and then have you decide whether that's acceptable or if you want to change it.
Okay.
Yeah, what I'm hearing, excuse me, what I'm hearing from my fellow commissioners is that I think we all agree and we should do it, but I think we just have to have from what you've heard us all talk about tonight, an ordinance prepared for our next meeting, and we can look at it. But I also agree that the people that already have that going, and they had gotten a license, and I think we should try to give them a little bit of a break, until we can get this all solved and a new ordinance out, and I'm sure they'll all comply with that.
Mr. Chair, we wanted to be able to start the process to make sure that the city was generally open to the idea of having short-term rentals, but I'm sure between Mr. Fang and myself that we can look at some type of provisional license so that they're able to continue to operate and also pay their TOT if they're actually renting their house or houses.
Yeah. Okay.
So going on to the next topic is, who should be allowed to establish a short-term rental? We talked already about it being primarily a primary residence, but there's also some discussion of considering vacation rentals. So we'll look at that as it relates to the ordinance. We'll include provisions that if it is a tenant, that they're obtaining approval from their landlord. And also if it's a homeowners association, they obtain homeowner association approval.
Wait, on the subject of tenant, are we all in agreement that a tenant that's only a tenant and does not own the property should be able to do short-term rentals? I don't think that should be an option.
No, I don't.
I don't either.
I don't think so.
I think it should be property owner.
It has to be the
Okay, so it has to be a primary residence and they have to own the unit.
I think I would agree with that.
Yes, correct.
Okay, so if they rent a house, then they're not able to supplement their income by being able to rent a room.
That's correct, because if you rent a house, they can take on roommates. Those are provisions that they can, or arrangements that they can do between themselves and the landlord. And I think it would complicate things for residents and for landlords.
How about the option if it were rented, that it can only be hosted and with the approval of the landlord? Only hosted.
Right, that would be an option. So that would be.
If it were only hosted. So, yeah, sorry.
Right, but that's what we were basically or not suggesting, but stating would be an option, is that if it is a tenant, they would have to have the approval of the property owner.
And hosted.
Well, and that would be your requirement in the ordinance of whether or not you're allowing for hosted, unhosted.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, for a tenant, I definitely would not do it unhosted. Like the tenant is leaving and just renting, and it's the tenant.
Right.
And how much of it goes to the tenant, how much goes to the landlord.
Right. Well, and this happens all the time. If you look at New York,
Yeah.
you know, people will say, I have an apartment and I'll let you take it for the weekend. I'll go someplace else. Right?
I don't know. I don't know.
I think I heard Melissa saying that she's done that.
No,
Oh, she's seen it done.
I don't know. I mean,
Yeah, I mean, I
so,
think
so
if it can
much.
be regulated,
Yeah.
if it can be regulated, I think maybe that's something that staff can look at.
Sorry.
The difficulty of regulating something, an arrangement like that. I mean, I think that would.
You know,
be-
I think to the extent that the person is not shown on the assessor as being the owner, we can require them to provide proof that they have the owner's permission.
Okay.
Right. And so that I don't think is difficult at all. Being able to regulate hosted versus unhosted becomes a little bit more complicated. That's a matter of reviewing the listings of how they're advertising the space. If they're just saying, I have a room that's available, then that's fairly easy. If they're saying, my whole apartment or my whole house is available, then that's something that, again, we can regulate it based on being able to review how they're posting their rentals.
If I may, my kids have used Airbnb. I haven't. How many of the listed Airbnbs are listed by the tenant and not the owner? Is there a percentage or?
I don't know if we really even know that at this
We
point.
don't know that. The hosting platforms truly don't specify if it's the owner or the tenant.
Right.
A lot of times, I have used Airbnb, so a lot of times when you're looking at a listing, if it is the owner, they'll say, I'm the owner. You know, you just have to take it at face value that they are, but they are regulated in terms of documentation that they have to provide to the Airbnb.
But I think it's
So-
primarily through the registration process that we would
Correct.
identify whether it's an owner unit or whether
That's the
it's
only
a
way.
tenant unit. Yeah.
So you wouldn't know yourselves if you're looking at the listing.
I don't know. I don't know. I'm on the fence with this. So.
Well, we
Whatever you
can
guys
we can
decide.
provide some more research, and when we come back to you, we'll make sure that we highlight maybe an option that you can consider.
And I just want to say, please forgive me if I look at my phone. It's just my daughter's home and she has some special circumstances and I just have to see the messages.
Okay.
So sorry.
Thank
No,
you.
no.
Thank you.
Okay. So the performance standards, we can go through them very quickly. Obviously, we've already agreed the TOT collection, it could be either or, so we can draft something. The property and building must be approved for residential use. So that is something that we have to make sure.
Did it skip a slide or?
We skipped a slide.
I think
but
the one
I think
we
it
skipped
was-
is the one on the permit process, and I think that's actually pretty
Yeah.
straightforward. So
Right.
we'll
That
just
had
come
to be
back with
permit.
what we think
Yeah.
are appropriate standards.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, because I had some questions about the permit process.
Okay.
Let's see. How do we do our business license are they online or?
Usually for this kind of business license, they
I'm sorry,
need to come-
speak into the mic.
Sorry. Usually for this kind of business license, they need to come to the city hall, and our business technician will help them with applying all the required business license.
Okay.
Right, but I think that the general question is whether or not you have online permitting, and I don't think currently the city has online permitting for their business license. It's done through the mail and through personal contact.
And then so we charge for a business license and the tax. There's a tax.
The business license will be charged to the owner of the business, and the sales TOT will be charged to those visitors.
Okay. And that's done through the Airbnb site, or how do we collect those taxes?
The business license tax will be collected based on the mail, or the owner will have to pay to us through mail or in person.
Mhm.
The TOT will be based on your decision. Either you want the platform to charge, or we will charge through their quarterly report.
Right, and typically what we found in the ordinances is that there's an obligation, excuse me, placed on the hosting platforms to collect, or the person who has the authorization to perform the STR, they have to make sure that it's transmitted to the city. But either way, there's a requirement for one of them to make sure that it gets paid. Because you may have some unusual circumstances where maybe it's not a traditional hosting platform and somebody's still doing a short-term rental. They could be doing it through, their sorority. Who knows? It could be something very unusual. So we need to be able to cover for both circumstances, but primarily we expect the hosting platform to assist because they're the ones that are collecting the monies up front.
And then do you know if we collect those fees quarterly, or how is it collected?
Most likely will be quarterly.
Okay.
Just out of curiosity, approximately how much is a business license, let's say, for something like this? Is it, if let's say a resident wants to do a short-term rental, I don't know, for maybe 30 days out of the year, would it be too onerous for them to, or not make financial sense for them to have to do a license and pay the taxes on that short-term rental?
So what you mean the business license we charge to the owner?
Yeah,
amount.
and
We charge based on the gross, but I believe for Airbnb, these kind of business, it won't be charged a lot. It's, I would say, about 100, around this amount.
Okay.
But it's still based on their gross.
Okay, thank you.
And this would be a new license, so the city council would be establishing whatever that license fee would be.
Question about that. You said the license fee is based on their gross.
Yes.
So how would you determine that for a new business, for someone who had never rented from Airbnb before? How
So
would they-
usually for this kind of for new license, is we'll ask them, we'll ask the owner, what's your estimated gross for the year? So at the end of the year, we suggest them to call us to find out if they have adjustment, if they need to pay more or less.
It's the same way they do the business license now, right?
Yes.
Okay, Maria, can we move on?
Yes, we may.
Wait, I had one more question. I guess for the commission, did we want to limit the days for the hosted and unhosted?
No, I don't think so. I think we agreed that maybe,
If for owner-occupied, no.
Yes.
I don't think we should. For secondary homes, we said we'd like to see a maximum of 90 days
yes, which is
as a test run.
yes, which is about a quarter of the year. Yeah.
I'm sorry, just to clarify, so you're saying for vacation homes?
Yes.
It would be 90 days? Because I had heard previously you talking about unhosted at 90 days too.
And that was in the beginning, but after I heard from the audience, I think we agreed that there needn't be a cap.
Okay.
So the cap would only be for the vacation homes if we try it for a year.
Okay.
And through the chair, it was 90-day cap. You were suggesting for vacation
That's what we're
homes?
thinking. I mean, we want to make it a number so that it is not overly beneficial to the point where we're going to lose housing stock.
Okay. So we will review that. Okay, so I think through here, we've gone through the TOT, the maximum number of days, we've gone through that. obviously, multiple bookings, we're not, because they're, we don't need to go through that. We're not
Well,
permitting
actually,
that, right?
that is a question, though, because if
okay.
if you have either a hosted or unhosted or vacation rental, are you allowing them to have more than one booking at a time? I think what we're finding with most of the ordinances is that they're not.
Right.
Right, so that you can only have one booking. So for example, if I'm a senior and I have a 3-bedroom home and I have 2 bedrooms available, I can rent 1 bedroom at a time, but I can't rent both of them at the same exact time
To two different.
to 2 different people.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I think if you start allowing that, you're becoming essentially a hotel.
That's
Yeah,
right.
I
Okay.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah, I agree with that one.
Okay, so prohibit.
What about parking, Maria?
Right, so in terms of parking, like I mentioned, we don't need to worry about apartments, but do we make sure that there is 1 space or 2? Depending on,
One space.
I think one
very,
space.
Very
One space
unlikely
is
for a
reasonable.
vacationing family to be with 2
Yeah,
cars.
Okay.
I'd say 1
I-
space.
okay.
I
If they
agree.
if they rent a car and
Yeah.
come and spend time, it's just 1 car for
Exactly.
the family.
Okay,
They have to provide at least 1
So
space.
many people are using Uber and Lyft now that,
right.
you know.
So
And-
just to stir it up a little bit in terms of questions, so is that just 1 space? So it could be either for the host who happens to be at the property, or is it
No.
in addition to the host?
In addition to the host, there needs to be one space.
Yeah.
Which would mean that it would be 2 spaces, at least 1 for the host family and 1 for the guest? Or are we just saying 1 that could be used for either?
So for instance, if there's a single a duplex, and there's only 1 garage.
In a duplex, I don't think the Hawthorne Municipal Code allows a duplex with 1 car, does it?
Old duplexes have only 1 car, very old ones.
But the
There
recent
are some.
Hawthorne Municipal Code does require that duplexes at least need 2 cars.
Yes.
So
Yeah, so I'm sure they probably
I'm
meet
saying
the
that- yeah,
the standards
they
if
meet the
if we
standards. I would say
ask
in
for 2
addition.
parking spaces.
yeah,
Right, so
I
if you
would
ask
say
for
in-
2, it shouldn't be a problem,
Yeah,
right?
I
Because that
would
way
say
there's at least
so.
1
Yeah,
for
we don't-
for the host and 1 for the other. And then if they're
Right.
duplexes or triplexes, we can use a similar standard. So we'll propose something to you.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. I
And
would
the
say-
parking can be a tandem parking. It doesn't have to be
Yeah,
separate.
it can be.
Yeah.
Right.
And then I have a question. I know there's like some areas that have like permit parking. Do we know like how many areas within the city have like permit parking for street parking?
I don't know how many areas, but I do know that they only give a certain amount of permits per property. I believe it's 3.
So, Oscar, do you know
Is that
where
right,
those are?
Oscar?
I know of one, and it's out in the Felton 116th, 115th area, right under the freeway. But I can't think of another area that has permitted parking only for that block or street.
Well, we'll take a look at that because I think that's kind of a practical issue because that shows that there's already parking impacts within that area. And so having some requirements for on-site parking may address it, but we'll make sure that we evaluate that when we come back.
And then because I was thinking, because I know somebody mentioned that some streets only have 1 side parking, it might be beneficial for those areas to have permit parking. That way, in case there's any Airbnbs that are throwing parties, not saying that they will, but that they have at least 2 parking passes for street parking for that residence, and then we can kind of regulate if there's visitors coming into the area that are just there for a party that they need a pass.
Yeah, I think if I understand correctly with Hawthorne, I think the city council is very, very hesitant of having any more permit parking areas. I mean, they tend to be,
Creates more issues.
yeah, it creates a lot more issues than it helps often. So trying to control for what's causing the issue might be better than trying to look at permit parking, but we will look into that and bring back more information.
Thank you.
And in terms of special events, I think most of our hosts have mentioned they don't have special events. So we would tend to lean towards not allowing the special events to rent a property for that if the commission
I
would
agree.
like to do that.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I don't think special events should be allowed. I don't know my fellow commissioners.
Okay. All right. I think we can move on to the next slide. So quiet hours, as I mentioned, we can add the no amplified music, and there is some criteria with the current municipal code. We can just keep that and not change it because I don't think we need to. It's there.
I agree on that, yeah.
Okay.
I just have a question on how do we enforce the hours for the noise?
Complaints.
Yeah.
Be an Oscar
Yes.
question.
Yeah.
Oscar.
Yeah, that would be based on complaints if that occurs. Obviously, if it's 2 in the morning, I'm sure our police department would be the ones that would be getting the complaints and notify our police department also what properties are short-term rentals, so they can let us know if they've received complaints on that property due to an event.
And then do they receive fines for noise
That
complaints?
will be done depending on the responding officer if that were to occur. I'm sure they usually give warnings if there's a noise complaint, but if it continues throughout the night, I'm sure they do issue fines.
And then you should probably just have it clear in the code to say, like, after a certain amount of complaints, there's a certain fee that we charge for those complaints, and if they exceed a certain amount, then their
License can be revoked.
yeah.
The license be revoked, yeah.
Right, so we'll place that in the draft ordinance that after a certain amount of complaints, their
lose their
license can be revoked.
Right, and that's something we were talking about before with penalties, that they could be
Right.
subject to administrative citation. So we'll incorporate that, and/or lose their right to have an STR.
Exactly, they would lose the right to have an STR. In terms of trash, since we're allowing hosted and unhosted, we don't.
It shouldn't be a big issue.
Shouldn't be
but
a big
We'll have a
issue.
performance standard that basically says that they can't have
Right.
basically unusual use of trash.
Bulky trash.
You know,
Right,
it
like a
has to- Can't be
maintenance.
visible from the public area, things along that line.
Correct. And the contact, obviously, that will be something that we will need to
Yeah.
have on there. The big one is notification. Do we want to notify the neighbors?
I don't
Yeah.
think it's necessary.
I
Yeah.
don't think there's
I don't
any
think you have to require
and-
anyone to notify their neighbors.
Yeah.
If they want to as a precaution, then that's fine, but I don't think we should regulate
Yeah.
whether.
Yeah, but I mean, sometimes you really don't want neighbors knowing when your house is empty, when it's
Exactly.
full.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and just on some of the comments that the residents said about overregulation, I think we should be careful not to
Correct.
overregulate.
Yeah,
You know,
I
we
think
can
so.
take it step by step.
That is
If
fine.
things aren't working out as we
Yeah,
planned, we
we
can
can-
always
yeah.
revisit.
Right. Yes, that's why staff just prepared a menu of items for you to consider.
And just one
And
question.
look at it after 1 year and see if we need to make some changes.
Exactly.
Simple.
We can
We
revisit.
can certainly do that, because if there's complaints or we had identified that there's just things that aren't working very well, then obviously we come back with an ordinance amendment to you.
Right.
But just one question on the notification to neighbors. So if it's a hosted or unhosted, but it's a primary residence, no notification. But if it's a vacation rental, where you may have more transitional, you're still okay with not having notification?
I don't think notification
Okay.
in any way
I,
is necessary.
I think we should, only because it's going to be hard for code enforcement to do their job. I know where a lot of cities, they pretty much rely on the neighbors to let them know what's going on. It doesn't have to be a notice for every time they rent it out, just letting them know that, hey, I have this permit, and that's it. This will help, code enforcement, because the neighbors will know, hey, they have a rental, short-term rental property, and that, I understand my rights, that I can, call code enforcement if there's any loud noises going on, and they can help us enforce our codes and regulations, and allow, code enforcement to do their job.
But
So
wouldn't it be the same thing if, the neighbor is going to call code enforcement, whether it's the resident or it's, a short-term rental, right? It really,
Yeah.
if there's loud noise after a certain time, it really doesn't
I mean,
Doesn't matter.
I really think it should be left to the owner of the home. Like, if they feel
Exactly.
that there's a necessity to tell, especially if it's not always occupied, and say, oh, don't worry if you see somebody, you know, I'm renting the house or something. But I don't think it should be, I mean, my personal opinion, it should be regulated.
Yeah, I agree.
think it
I don't
just-
think it should be another hurdle
Yeah.
that the resident has to.
I think it'd just be a comment
Courtesy,
made when they
yes.
apply for their license that, you know,
Yeah.
it's your responsibility to notify your neighbors.
Yeah. I mean,
You know,
All right.
I have a neighbor that in my general area that has a party at least maybe once a month, and I have yet to be invited.
Wow.
That's a problem.
Okay.
But they cut down the loud music too by 10 o'clock, so that's fine.
All right. I think the last thing, we've gone through the permissions. We said tenants would need approval by the property owner and the condos by their HOA,
Yeah.
if there is one. Yeah.
Yep.
I think that's about it.
Well, the other
Okay.
one would be
So-
on inspections, whether or not you want any inspection and minimum standards. So for example, whether they have to have smoke detectors, fire extinguishers, is there a list of things that you want us just to tell them they need to have them, or do you want it to be subject to inspection?
The pre-permitting inspection. Mm-hmm.
I think through an inspection, when the inspector goes out there to look at the house, he should be the one to say, well, you probably should put fire extinguisher here or whatever, smoke detectors.
Because there's two ways of handling it. One would be a certification where we simply have kind of the shopping list of things that they should have. And then they will just certify that, yes, I have those things. Or we'll say, okay, we want to come physically check and make sure that you have whatever it might be. Could be parking, right? As
Yeah.
well as any other features that would be appropriate.
No, I like the certification idea just because it puts the burden on the
owner.
owner, and the city's not liable if they miss something, or I mean, it's less regulation. I think if it's one of those things that if it's not working out, there's a lot of issues, maybe we could revisit that.
Okay. The certification with the list of items.
Oh, one other thing that occurred to me. So we're talking about hosted and unhosted. If owner has a triplex or there's 4 units on the complex, and the owner lives in the front one, he's got 3 units in the back. So are we talking about that owner being able to do short-term rentals on all 3 of the rest of the units, unlimited? I think we should discuss that a little bit more. I think that could create issues as
Right.
well.
Based on your discussions tonight, you're also saying that all 4 units could theoretically be rented, because you even said that a vacation rental could be for 90 days. So there could be a time where you don't have any owner occupancy on the property if you just take that to its conclusion. But right now, based on what we've been talking about, it doesn't sound like there would be any limitations. Any of those units would be eligible.
As long as there's enough parking. And I know that they wouldn't have been approved had there not been enough parking. Like if I have 4 units that were built 60 years ago and only have 2 spots, maybe I would have a problem with that.
Right.
So
So
we-
if it's 4 units, we have to at least identify that it has to be 1 parking spot per unit. I mean, I don't know if that's okay.
I think my opinion is we should limit the extent of the short-term rentals if there's 4 units. So what about if there's 5 units on the property? I mean,
Well, if
Do we
it's,
even allow that?
if it's 5 units, then it becomes an apartment.
okay.
And we were just saying, or the commission was saying that they didn't want to see apartments being used.
So 4 units maximum, and potentially
1 parking.
the entire year that those 4 units could be rented, short-term rented.
How many parcels do we have that allow 4 units?
We would have to evaluate that. There's
We
probably
would.
a number of properties that have
Are.
duplex, triplex, or fourplex.
Mm.
Perhaps what we can do is we'll come back with some options for you to consider.
Yeah, and see like
Right.
the percentage of how many we have existing. And
We can see if we can run that analysis. That might be a little bit complicated, but we can look. But there's also the ability to have a by right, maybe have 1 unit that can be used. And then if you want a second or a third, maybe there's a special authorization that would be needed. So we can look at that as
That's
well.
a
So
good
it
option.
doesn't have to be an all or nothing.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah, it's cool. Okay,
And I think we already talked about the reporting, so that's
We
pretty
did.
straightforward. And the penalties we've talked about. So
Correct.
I think at that, we probably have received all the information we need, unless you have more 2 cents or nickels that you want to throw in.
How about this, I think? You've done an excellent job, as
Thank you.
always, all of you.
okay, if we're finished with that, then we'll move on. Do any of the commissioners have any report you'd like to give?
May I?
Yes, ma'am.
I may, sir. Okay, so I know it's a very taboo topic, but what authority do we have over the mall? So, how much power do we have to request any change? Or, I mean, it's been since 1995.
1997, I believe, because I asked the
1997.
same question. Well, this item is not on your agenda, so we can't have a lengthy discussion, but
Oh,
I will
I
just...
understand that.
I will just basically respond by saying that the city does have its zoning authority.
Yes.
So there are certain things that we could do in terms of permitted land uses and things that are not permitted. We also have provisions related to public nuisance, whether or not they're in compliance or creating something that would be considered to be blighted. We are having discussions currently related to the mall. They are currently receiving citations.
Okay.
But generally, the city has a number of different things that they can do, but it's often difficult if you don't have a property owner who's willing to transition.
I understand that, but may I kindly request to agendize at least a briefing of what's going on and making us understand so that the public understands what is within our scope of authority to do. Like I get asked that question all the time. That's the first
Certainly.
question that anybody ever asks me.
Certainly. And what I would recommend is we'll put a more generic item on the agenda to talk about code enforcement.
Okay.
Basically, code enforcement and zoning. How are they utilized as tools in order to provide regulation of vacant and otherwise other land uses? Yes, that would allow for conversation about the mall and probably a lot of other properties.
Okay. Thank you.
That's really good, yeah. Okay, anything else?
I appreciate the study sessions. They're very informative, and for us and for the community. I just wanted to say I appreciate staff for that.
Well, thank you. And we also appreciate the community coming out tonight because I thought we
Absolutely.
received a lot of really good information from them as well.
Yes, definitely.
Nice to have people in the audience.
Yes.
They're feeling love tonight.
It's normally silent.
Okay, we will now adjourn the meeting at 8:10.
Thank you very much.